She had rehearsed the walk a dozen times in her head, but standing at the foot of the drive, looking up at Ash Grove with its pale stone front and the ivy grown too thick across the east wing the way it always had, her legs nearly refused her. She told herself it was the cold. It was not the cold. Isadora Pembridge had spent 22 months learning how to become someone else. She had taken the name Clara Holt at a coaching inn 40 miles north and practiced it until it stopped feeling like a lie. She had sold her mother's pearl earrings, not because she needed the money, though she did, but because she could not afford to be recognized by anyone who had ever seen her wearing them. She had let her hands go rough. She had stopped correcting her posture at dinner. She had learned to look at people only long enough to understand what they wanted, then look away. She had become, in other words, precisely the sort of woman no one would ever look at twice. The iron gate to Ash Grove opened without a sound. She had always loved that. Her father had insisted on the hinges being oiled every spring without exception. Whoever was maintaining the property now had kept up the habit. She filed that detail away the way she had learned to file everything, quietly, without expression. The housekeeper met her at the servants' entrance. Her name was Mrs. Bryce, and she was the sort of woman who communicated an entire opinion of a person in the first 4 seconds of looking at them. She looked at Isadora for slightly longer than that, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. "Miss Holt," she said, not as a question. "Yes, ma'am, you come from the Langley household." "I do." She had the letter. She had spent 3 weeks cultivating the letter, which had cost her considerably more than the earrings. "They were kind enough to recommend me." Mrs. Bryce took the letter without opening it. "His Grace doesn't take much interest in the household staff. That's my domain. But I'll tell you what I tell every woman who comes through that door." She paused, as if deciding whether Isadora was worth the full version. Apparently she was. Ash Grove is not a difficult house. It runs because people do their jobs and mind their own business. The women who don't last are the ones who find that second part difficult. I understand. The salary is £11 per annum. You'll take meals in the servants' hall. Your half-day is Thursday, and you'll share a room with the between-stairs maid until the east room is sorted. Mrs. Bryce finally opened the letter, scanned it with the economy of someone who had read 10,000 such letters, and folded it again. "Can you sew? Well enough, right? Yes, then you'll do." She handed back the letter, which surprised Isadora. "That room there is your room for now. You start this afternoon." The afternoon began with a basket of mending and a window that wouldn't latch properly, which was how Isadora spent her first 20 minutes at Ash Grove, sitting in a room that smelled of damp plaster and beeswax, listening to the house settle around her, doing needlework she had learned at 11 years old in the room directly above this one. She had not expected to feel so strange about it. She had prepared for cold, for hardness, for the specific indignity of being invisible in the place where she had grown up, pressing her nose against the library windows and demanding her father read to her from the maps. What she had not prepared for was how ordinary it all felt. The kitchen was still where the kitchen had always been. The creaking stair was still the third one from the top. The smell of the front hall, lemon oil, and something faintly mineral, the stone itself perhaps, was the same as it had been the morning they'd carried her father out of it for the last time. She pressed the feeling down and finished the mending. She did not meet the Duke of Vexmoor until the following morning, and she would spend considerable time afterward trying to decide whether that first impression was accurate, or whether she had simply been tired. He was in the corridor outside the study when she came around the corner carrying a stack of linen that needed cataloging. She had been assigned the task somewhat arbitrarily, she suspected, to test whether she could be trusted to count, and he was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the garden with the focused stillness of a man working through an argument in his head. She nearly walked directly into him. "Pardon me, Your Grace." He turned. Gideon Vexmore was. She had known this from inquiry, had collected a precise description of him from 3 separate sources before she ever arrived at Ashgrove. 31 years old, dark-haired, with the particular look of someone who had spent enough time outdoors that his face had forgotten how to be entirely indoor appropriate. He was not what she would have called handsome, if handsome meant symmetrical and composed. He was something more angular than that, something that required a second look. She did not give him one. She kept her eyes at approximately the level of his second button and waited. "You're the new one," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. Clara Holt." He looked at her the way men in his position sometimes looked at domestic staff, not unkindly, but with a specific quality of non-seeing, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been slightly rearranged. "Right." He was already looking back at the window. "Mrs. Bryce has you sorted?" "She has, Your Grace." "Good." That was all. She walked on. She would think about that moment later. The particular quality of his indifference, the way it had settled over her like something almost comfortable. He did not know who she was. He had no idea that the woman carrying his household linen had spent every summer of her childhood in the room 2 doors behind him, that she knew the garden he was staring at better than he ever would, that the estate he now controlled, by a series of events so improbable she had still not entirely accepted them, had been in her family for 140 years before he set foot in it. He did not know, and for now, that was exactly what she needed. On her 4th day at Ashgrove, the Duke's solicitor arrived. His name was Mr. Thorne, and he was a small, precise man who wore his authority like a well-fitted coat, present, unmistakable, and entirely deliberate. He spent the morning closeted in the study with the Duke, and the sound of their voices, low, occasionally sharp, carried into the corridor where Isadora was ostensibly reorganizing a linen cupboard that did not need reorganizing. She had stationed herself there on purpose. She caught fragments, the deed, the secondary clause. "If she cannot be found by Michaelmas," and then, more clearly than the rest, in a voice she recognized as Thorne's, "The estate cannot remain in trust indefinitely, Your Grace. There are obligations." She pressed her back against the wall and breathed through it. She had known this. She had known this since the letter had reached her in Edinburgh. The letter from her father's second solicitor, the one his brother had not managed to intercept, explaining what had happened to Ashgrove in the 14 months since her father died. The entail, the clause that no one had thought to explain to her until it was already in motion. The fact that because she could not be located, because her uncle had told everyone she had gone abroad, because she had, in fact, gone abroad, because she had been 20 years old, and alone, and frightened, and had not understood what was being taken from her until it was nearly gone. Ashgrove had passed into trust administered by a distant cousin of her father's, who happened to hold a dukedom, and apparently had very little idea what to do with a Somerset estate. She had come back as soon as she understood. She had come back and done the one thing she could think of to do. She had gotten herself inside the house. She needed to find the document. Her father had told her about it once, sitting in the library with a glass of brandy he only half drank, the way he'd talked to her about serious things, as if she were a colleague, not a daughter. He had amended his will, he said, with a specific rider regarding the property, not filed with the primary solicitor. That office her uncle owned effectively through a combination of long association and certain financial arrangements Isadora preferred not to think about. The rider was here, in the house, in a place only she would know to look. She had 4 days left before the Michaelmas deadline. The difficulty was that she was not, technically, permitted in the library. The library at Ashgrove had been designated, in some reorganization that predated her arrival, as the Duke's private working space. Mrs. Bryce had mentioned it her first day. The library was off-limits except when specifically requested, and staff were to knock before entering and not to linger. Isadora had spent 3 of her 4 days constructing a reason to enter it. On the 5th morning, she got one. The between-stairs maid, a girl named Dottie, who was 17 and afraid of bats and had, Isadora suspected, a considerable amount of native intelligence she had not yet had occasion to use, came down to breakfast with a red face and a story about having left the Duke's correspondence from yesterday unstacked on the library desk when she'd been sent in to dust. "He'll notice," Dottie whispered, more to her porridge than to Isadora. "He notices everything. He came in last week, and the inkstand was 2 inches to the left, and he didn't say anything, but he moved it back." "I'll take them," Isadora said. Dottie looked at her. "I'll say I was asked to. Miss Bryce is in the village this morning." She kept her voice exactly even. "It's not a difficult thing, Dottie. The letters are already stacked wrong. I'm only sorting them properly." This was, she recognized, not a particularly virtuous piece of reasoning. She set it aside. The library had not changed in any way that mattered. This was the thing that nearly undid her, standing in the doorway for the 3 seconds she allowed herself before she had to start moving, because the library had been her father's great project, his accumulation of 40 years, and it was all still here. The maps still in the broad, flat drawers, the natural history volumes still in the wrong order, because her father had believed in organizing books by how much he loved them, which had driven his librarian half to madness. The window seat still had the faded cushion that had been there since before she was born. She crossed to the desk first, stacked the correspondence with the brisk efficiency of someone who was definitely only here for the correspondence. Then she went to the fireplace. The writer was not in a locked box or a hidden compartment behind a painting, because her father had had very little patience for anything theatrical. He had slipped it, he told her, behind the false back of the bottom shelf on the left side of the chimney breast, where the encyclopedias were kept, because no one, he said, ever consulted an encyclopedia in a hurry. Her fingers found the edge of the false back on the first try. Years of absence, it turned out, did not affect muscle memory. She felt paper. She was sliding it free when she heard the door. The Duke was not supposed to be in the house. He wrote out every morning, 6 days in 7. She had confirmed this with Dottie, and with the groom, and with her own observation from the window. He rode out and he came back at midday, and he spent the afternoon in the study and not in the library. He was in the library. She had the document behind her back, pressed flat between her palms, her shoulders touching the shelf, when he came through the door and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Miss Holt," he said, "Your Grace, I was asked to sort the correspondence." The letters were on the desk, visibly sorted. She did not move from the wall. Something in his expression shifted, not suspicion, exactly, but the focused quality she had noticed in the corridor, as if he had decided she was worth a second look after all. "That doesn't explain why you're standing at the bookcase. I noticed one of the encyclopedia volumes was displaced." This was true. Volume 7 was, in fact, a 1/4 inch out of line. She had not displaced it, but it was there. He looked at the shelf. He looked at her. He crossed the room. She did not move. He was close enough now that she could see the particular quality of his attention, that angular, indoor, inappropriate face doing something complicated. He reached past her and straightened the volume. "Thank you," he said, and stepped back. "Of course, Your Grace." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Holt." She turned. "You're from the north," Mrs. Bryce said. "Yorkshire, Your Grace. You don't have a Yorkshire accent." The silence between them was about 4 seconds long. She counted them. "My mother was from Hampshire," she said. "She was particular about it." He nodded, in the way of a man who has decided provisionally to accept an answer he is not entirely convinced by. She left. She read the document in the room she shared with Dottie, who was blessedly in the kitchen learning to make pastry and would not be back for an hour. She read it twice. Then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and took 3 long breaths. It was what she had hoped it was. Her father had been careful. He had seen something coming. She did not know how much he had known about his brother's intentions. But he had seen enough, and he had been careful, and he had left her a way back in. The writer specified that in the event of any claim upon Ashgrove being made under the standard entail, said claim was superseded by a direct bequest to his daughter, Isadora Pembridge, contingent on her presentation of this document and appropriate proof of identity to the estate solicitor. Not her uncle's solicitor, but the secondary firm, Whitfield and Carow of Bath, whose address was included. She had 4 days. Bath was 7 hours by coach. She had enough money for the coach fare if she did not eat between now and Thursday. There was one problem. The document needed a witness signature, a credible one, and the only person at Ashgrove with the legal standing to witness such a thing. The only person whose name on that line would mean anything when she walked into the offices of Whitfield and Carow was Gideon Vexmore, the Duke of Vexmore, who did not know who she was, who had very nearly caught her removing this document from his library wall, and who was under the distinct impression that she was a domestic employee from Yorkshire with a Hampshire-educated mother. She needed, in other words, to tell him the truth. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she straightened her back, folded the document into her apron pocket, and went to find him. He was in the study, as she had expected. The door was half open. She knocked on the frame. "Yes, I need to speak with your grace." She had thought carefully about how to begin this. All of the careful thought, it turned out, had led her to the conclusion that there was no good way to begin it. "It concerns Ashgrove." He looked up. He had a pen in his hand. "Mrs. Bryce handles. It doesn't concern the household." She came through the door. She had the document. She put it on the desk in front of him. "This concerns the estate." He put the pen down. He read it, and she watched his face, because she could not afford not to. He read it the way he seemed to do most things, with complete attention, without hurry, without any legible emotion until he had all of the information he needed. Then he looked up at her. "Isadora Pembridge," he said. "Yes. You've been in this house for 5 days. Yes. Sorting linen. Yes." His expression was, she could not read it. She had been reading people's expressions for 2 years, had become rather good at it, but his face was doing something that required more data than she currently had. "Why?" he said. "Because I needed to find that document, and I couldn't find it without getting inside the house. And I couldn't get inside the house without, no." He stood. He was taller when he stood, somehow more of a presence, and she made herself hold her ground. "Why are you here instead of wherever you were? Why did no one know where you were? Why has this gone on for 14 months? "Because I didn't know," she said. "I was 20 years old when my father died, and I trusted the wrong people to tell me the truth about what was happening. And by the time I understood, the entail had already been invoked, and you were already here, and I had no legal standing to do anything except find that document and get it to Bath before Michaelmas." The silence was longer this time. "Your uncle," he said. It was not quite a question. "My uncle," she agreed. Something moved across his face then. She still couldn't name it precisely. He looked at the document again. He looked at her, at the rough hands, she thought, at the apron, at whatever story 5 days of Miss Holt told across her face. "I need to confirm this with Thorne," he said. "Your solicitor was here 2 days ago. He will confirm that a rider of this kind is entirely valid. He will also confirm that Whitfield and Carow of Bath are the appropriate firm, and that the Michaelmas deadline applies to the trust administration, not to this bequest. He looked at her with an expression she finally recognized. It was not suspicion or embarrassment or anger, though she thought all three of those might come later. It was the expression of a man who was recalculating something fundamental. "You've already spoken to Thorne," he said. "I've spoken to a great many solicitors in the last 14 months. He picked up the document, set it down, picked up his pen, then set the pen down as well. I'm going to need you to tell me," he said very evenly, "everything that happened, from the beginning." "I know," she said. "I will. But first, I need you to sign that document." He signed it. She would not let herself think about what that meant until later, until she was on the coach to Bath, with the document in her inner pocket and the peculiar exhaustion of 2 years of sustained pretending finally starting to make itself felt in her bones. Only then, watching the Somerset fields go gray in the early evening, did she let herself think about the look on his face when he had picked up the pen. He had not hesitated. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had expected argument, or at minimum a lengthy period of confirmation and correspondence. She had prepared herself carefully for every variation of no. He had simply signed it. Thorne, reached by urgent messenger that same afternoon, had confirmed everything within 3 hours. There had been, apparently, certain things about the administration of the Ashgrove Trust that had troubled him. Irregularities in the original filing that he had been unable to resolve to his satisfaction. Isadora Pembridge's existence, and the existence of the rider, resolved them entirely. Her uncle, Thorne added, in the particular tone of a solicitor being as precise as possible while conveying something he found professionally distasteful, had been aware of the rider. He had chosen not to disclose it. She did not cry about this on the coach. She had cried about it 14 months ago in a rented room in Edinburgh, and she did not have it in her to cry about it again. She looked at the fields instead. She thought about the library. The false back of the shelf still holding the shape where the document had been. The cushion on the window seat, the way her father's books were shelved in order of love. She was at Whitfield and Carrow when the offices opened the next morning. The meeting took 2 hours. The junior partner sent 3 messages in the course of it. One to the Ashgrove solicitor's office, one to the Court of Chancery, and one that he would not tell her the destination of, though she suspected, from the expression on his face when he wrote it, that it was to her uncle. She walked out of the building at 11:30 into mild autumn sunshine, and she stood on the pavement and tried to understand that it was done. Ashgrove was hers. The deed would be formalized within a fortnight. The trust was dissolved. Her uncle's position, as her father's brother, as the man who had made certain she could not be located, as the man who had known about the rider and said nothing, would be a matter for other proceedings. Proceedings she found she was not yet ready to contemplate in detail. She had a return coach to catch at 2 o'clock. She bought herself a meat pie from a stall near the coaching inn, because she had not eaten since the previous afternoon, and she sat on a bench in a small park that smelled of fallen leaves, and ate it in its entirety without a trace of self-consciousness, which was something she suspected Miss Clara Holt would have been comfortable with, and which Isadora Pembridge 2 years ago would not have been. She was not sure, entirely, which of them she was going to be from here on. The Duke was in the front hall when she arrived back at Ashgrove, at 9:30 in the evening. This surprised her. She had expected to speak with Mrs. Bryce, or perhaps no one, to slip in through the servant's entrance and have the difficult conversation in the morning, when she was less tired and the ground had firmed somewhat under her. She had not expected him to be standing in the front hall with a lamp and what appeared to be a letter he had been in the middle of reading when he heard the carriage. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp made the hall look the way she remembered it best, which was unfortunate. "Whitfield and Caro," he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded. There was a pause that was not, she noticed, uncomfortable in the way she would have expected. "I sent Thorne the full account this morning," he said. "Your uncle will likely be contacted by the end of the week." "I know. The junior partner told me." "Good." He held the letter. She realized now it was from Thorne, must have arrived this evening, and looked at her with that same recalculating expression from the study. "I had Mrs. Bryce prepare the east bedroom," he said, "the larger one with the garden view." She was very still. "She didn't ask questions," he added. "She's not that sort of woman." "No," Isadora said after a moment. "She isn't. I imagine there are arrangements to be made about the household. About." He made a slight gesture that encompassed, she thought, the considerable awkwardness of the situation, the 5 days of linen and mending and encyclopedias, the fact that she knew where the cook kept the good knives and that the third stair still creaked, the fact that he had been administering her house and was now going to have to leave it, and that they were both going to have to pretend this had all been entirely manageable. "There are," she said, "but not tonight." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he inclined his head, the particular half-bow of a man who was navigating something unprecedented with deliberate courtesy, and stepped back from the doorway. She walked through the front hall of Ashgrove for the first time as herself, and the lamp caught the edge of the portrait on the east wall, her father's face in oil looking down at her from where it had always been. And she did not stop walking, but she pressed her hand once, briefly, against the wall as she passed it, the way she used to do as a girl, for luck or for greeting or for something in between. She found him in the garden 3 days later. Not intentionally. She had gone out to look at the state of the kitchen garden, which had been allowed to get ahead of itself in ways that offended her practically. And he was at the far end by the old stone wall, standing in that particular still way of his, looking at nothing specific. She nearly turned back. She did not. "The roses need cutting back," she said, coming to stand beside him at a proper distance. "They've been allowed to go on too long. I'm told I'm not to interfere with the garden. You're not. I'm telling you about it, not asking you to do anything." Something in his expression shifted. She thought for the first time that he was finding something faintly amusing. "Miss Pembridge, you can call me Isadora." She had no idea why she said it. She blamed the garden, the particular quality of early autumn light on old stone. After the past 5 days, I think the formality is somewhat beside the point. He was quiet for a moment. "Gideon, then," he said. "Since we're dispensing with formality." She looked at the roses. They genuinely did need cutting back. She would have to find someone who knew what they were doing, or learn to do it herself. She was beginning to understand, a great deal to relearn about being the person in charge of this place. A great deal she had thought she knew and didn't. A great deal she hadn't known she'd need. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for deceiving you. It was necessary, but that doesn't make it. I know it doesn't make it comfortable to think about." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He turned to look at her directly, and she made herself meet it. "But I've spent the last 3 days reading through the trust documents, all of them." A pause. "What your uncle did was—" He stopped. "Thorne has words for it, legal words. I prefer not to use them in a garden." She almost smiled. "Yes, you did what you had to do." He said it with the finality of a man who had, in fact, thought it through carefully and arrived at a conclusion he intended to stand by. "That's all there is to say about it, really." She looked at him, the angular face, the outdoors appropriate quality of it, the complete and genuine absence of performance, and thought that her father, who had also been a man who arrived at conclusions and stood by them, would have found him interesting. "You'll need to decide what you're doing," she said, "about where you're going. I don't want to turn you out of. I mean to say, there's no urgency." "But I imagine you have a house in London." "I have a house in London," he agreed. "I also have, as it turns out, an entirely unexpected quantity of respect for whoever designed this garden." "That was my mother," she said. "She had strong opinions about roses." Another silence, this one softer at the edges. "Tell me about her," he said, and it was said simply, with the directness of a man who meant what he said and nothing more complicated than that. And Isadora, who had spent 2 years not telling anyone anything, found, to her considerable surprise, that she wanted to. The garden was still around them. The roses needed cutting. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Bryce was doing something efficient and unsentimental, which was what she did every day, and would presumably keep doing regardless of which version of Isadora Pembridge was in charge. She started talking. He listened, and Ash Grove held them both in the autumn afternoon, as it had held her family for 140 years. The stone warm with stored sun and the ivy over the east wing, finally, slowly, letting in the light.